Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the first talk that is taking place in the frame of Haegue Yang's exhibition, Several Reenactments, which is currently on view at S.M.A.K until September 10th. The public talks and lectures that will unfold in the coming months aim to explore Yang's multifaceted practice, her creative path, and the lines she draws in the exhibition here at S.M.A.K. So we have put together with the artists 3 public talks and lectures that follow the same logic of doubling inherent to the exhibition, and Yang wishes to pair and bring together international museum curators and scholars during these events. The goal of these events is to embody the artist's vision and aesthetics, allowing the audience to witness the different currents and dynamism in her oeuvre and in the exhibition here at S.M.A.K. So for the first talk today, we welcome Yung Ma, who is currently serving as curator at the Hayward Gallery in London. Welcome, Yung. And also thank you for having accepted our invitation. We are very pleased. So I will shortly introduce Yung Ma before we start the lecture. And afterward, we have foreseen some time for questions, of course. So I will introduce Yung Ma briefly. Yung Ma served as the artistic director of the 11th Seoul Media City Biennale in 2021. He was previously curator of the Contemporary Art and Prospective Creation Department at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, and also associate curator of Moving Image at M+ in Hong Kong. Yung Ma is also currently preparing a major survey exhibition on the work of Haegue Yang that will take place next year at the Hayward Gallery. So to give some introduction about Haegue Yang, she was born in 1971 in Seoul and Korea. She's an artist who lives and works in Seoul and Berlin. And one can say that throughout her career and oeuvre, she has been constantly negotiating and also traversing boundaries between different geographies, historical eras, and artistic styles. Yang is an artist who creates materially rich works and also compositionally specific installations and arrangements for each exhibition. Her refined yet singular vision of materiality, combined with an elegant sense of space and atmosphere, contribute to the development of enveloping and resonant installations for each exhibition she conceives. One can also say that her oeuvre encompasses large-scale sculptures, installations, as well as works on paper, photography, video essays, audio pieces, sound, and text-based work, as you will see later on in the talk when Yung will intervene. And one can say also that as sensorial as they are fluid or immersive works result in a mapping of heterogeneous times and places, and this we will address and explain today. So the aim of this first talk is to begin a reflection on the exhibition of Yang that you see upstairs in the museum, which is, and you can see with the image behind us, which is Yang's first monographic exhibition in Belgium. Haegue Yang is an internationally exhibited artist. Her work is known in the Belgian context, but not that much in the contemporary art field, hence the invitation by S.M.A.K to really give her carte blanche to deploy a new body of work, but also existing works. And this is something we will explain here better, the notion of a continuous circling in the exhibition that allows to create a kind of inter-contextuality. And the way Haegue has envisioned the exhibition and the project here was to think of the museum and the exhibition space as a multi-site with a manifold and also overlapping structure. And as you see here in the picture and also witness in the exhibition, her artworks often appear as pairs or interconnected groups, while synchronizing different qualities of repetition that she has been trying to explore. As you see in the picture here, I have talked about. We will talk about further about different notions that come out through the œuvre in relationship to borders, time, place, and also I quote Haegue, a kind of mapping of times and places that are not normally neighbors, unquote. This is very important way to approach her work. To understand how in the work and in the exhibition several artworks, histories, cultural references inhabit the space while not being neighbors or being foreign to each other. So what you see here with the Ghent Commission, because as I said, this was very a commitment by the museum to invite Haegue to make a new commission, a major work. What you see here is a part of a 17-part work entitled Warrior, Believer, Lover version Sonic. So this is a work from 2023, which is occupying the central gallery at S.M.A.K and arranged in several groups. And these cultural ensembles are reenactments of another multi-part installation, which is entitled Warrior, Believer, Lover, and that dates from 2011. And the proposal of Haegue here was to constitute a horizontally open sculptural field, which is accompanied during the exhibition by Igor Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps, which is a 1913 piece. So one could say this is really the central work in the exhibition. And the notion of reenactment, repetition, doubling, and mirroring is really a strategy we find throughout this exhibition. And I will say a few words about Warrior, Believer, Lover. So this each cluster of this body of sculptures has a distinctive title. So one of them is Sonic Female Natives. I think these are the ones you see here around here. The other one is Sonic Medicine Men, another one is Sonic Totem Robots, Sonic Pine Spells, and also Sonic Stunt Dance. And the specificity of this work is that it's really made from a vast array of artisanal and also industrially manufactured objects, arranged very rigorously by the artist, lending also the work a remarkable complexity in terms of the materials, the composition, and the way it is being handled. And you can also notice it on the photo behind us that the sculptures are also adorned with artificial plants, wigs, and we don't see it. Yeah, you see it on the right. Some have also these solar lamps. Yeah. And I think the intention also of the artist was to try to explore the limits of nature and artifice, as well as totemic and ritualistic movement. And I talked about Le Sacre du Printemps by Igor Stravinsky. I think it's important to mention that Le Sacre du Printemps is always played whenever Warrior, Believer, Lover is presented. And in Ghent here, it is played only at specific times that actually coincide with the Ghent local Islamic prayer times. So this means that during the museum opening hours, the piece is played at the very specific time that people pray in this city. And we know that this is also based on the lunar calendar, so it means that between April and September, at the end of the exhibition, these times will shift also. And I was talking a bit earlier about a mapping of times and places and elements which are not specifically neighbors. And I think this is an artistic proposal, an idea that really brings together Stravinsky and a very local element related to Ghent and other rituals and religious practices. But why Stravinsky also? Because it's a way for the artist to reference Slavic pagan spring sacrifices, and the Stravinsky's atonal orchestration for the ballet russe and the history of the avant-garde is also juxtaposed with the Islamic prayer times, as I mentioned. I will finish on the Stravinsky, but also important to mention that Le Sacre du Printemps kind of conjures a primitive pagan culture through anti-classical movements and also visual elements that are coupled with dissonant music. Continue further. I will not expand that much on that slide, but I just wanted to say that, and I invite you afterwards that we also go together in the exhibition. But Haegue Yang, for several reenactments, has really worked with the architecture of the space, or experience of the architecture of the space. And this notion of mirroring and repetition, she has really implemented it in the exhibition itself. So it means that you have the central hall, and on the left and the right of the hall, you have two cabinets. So you have a cabinet on the left and a cabinet on the right. For each of those cabinets, Haegue has created displays that also mirror each other and build a quasi-symmetry.
Hello. Hi. I'm Young. Thanks for coming on a Saturday afternoon. And thank you, Karima, for inviting me here as well. I think it's all Haegue sort of masterminding that I'm here. I think, when we start talking about this conversation, of course, because the nature of the exhibition here at S.M.A.K, which Karima was saying, how Haegue worked with the space and in terms of actually amplifying her ideas with working with the concept of doubling, mirroring, and all that, which I think some of you probably have seen the show already, so you sort of know what we're talking about. But I thought it might be interesting to also present an image from this exhibition at the S.M.K, which is very similar to S.M.A.K as well, in Copenhagen earlier, a very recent a survey exhibition of Haegue's works in Denmark. And the title of the show was actually called Double Soul. So it was really heightened in terms of the idea of doubling. And formally speaking, the structure really of the exhibition space, this is the main space of the show. And it was really kind of a mirror image of works being presented in the galleries, and you go down towards the end, and there was a large blind installation by Haegue, an earlier blind installation. It's sort of quite interesting because, what Karima was saying earlier, I'm actually working with Haegue for a show at Hayward next year, what's very interesting for me is the fact that I've known Haegue for a very long time, but we've never actually worked together before. So when I started to get to know her practice, it was sort of around 2007, 2008. And it was actually quite a different kind of practice, I think, in comparison to what she's been doing over the last few years. And I think we have some examples later on in the talk as well. But the reason I'm so saying this now is I think the idea of mirroring or doubling really sort of emerged over the last few years as well. I think that has a lot to do in relation of how she's always sort of trying to look at, culturally speaking, but also conceptually speaking, looking at her counterparts. And that counterpart could actually be herself sometimes. And that has something to do with her experience of living in two different cities, Berlin and Seoul, and I think being a diaspora essentially over the last 20 or so years, that has a huge impact in terms of how she's conceiving her practice and how she actually interacts and reacts towards the institutional structure as well per se. But I also kind of want to say the fact that in terms of doubling, I think it might be slightly a limiting notion in terms of understanding her practice as well, because she's not really just taking one point and just directly responding to a counterpart of that. She's really merging different narratives, different histories, different practices, different cultures in the practice. So it's in terms of this mirror construction, you get multiple circles and overlaps within that structure. And I think that is actually kind of quite crucial to understand the practice. And that's how I think it's very clear here at the show here that is the approach. And I think, by using this space, working with the architecture space here, that's really pretty much been heightened as well. Maybe we can go to the next slide, and I hope that works. Yeah, so this is a slightly earlier work from 2008 called Doubles and Couples, version Turin. And the reason is she's actually done other versions of that. There's another one at least, if I remember correctly. And this, well, first of all, I would love to have this work in our show at Hayward, but I'm not sure whether we can do that yet, but because it's in the collection. But the work actually emerged when she started working with the Venetian blind, and it's actually in combination of a series of works that she's been producing, which is the Appliances series. And these structures that you're looking at, they are actually replicas of household appliances. So they're boilers, fridges, radiators. And more specifically, they are actually a replica of all these kind of appliances in the apartments that she was living at that time in Berlin and in Seoul. And they've been actually mashed together. So they're always double. They're presented as a pair. So that's what I was kind of talking about earlier. A lot of the practice is actually coming from, even though it's actually so looking at a lot of different issues that we all have to deal with at the moment, or we've been dealing with. But ultimately, they also come from a very personal point of view, and actually addressing some sort of practices in a very formal way as well. Because the reason she's interested in Venetian blinds is actually her way of addressing abstract paintings. The lines of the blinds actually for her is actually her answer in a way to how she could imagine abstract painting can be involved in the future, and then bringing in these kind of very personal elements, the spaces that she was living in at that time, and these kind of almost the presence of artists being actually reimagined and combined into these slightly, really kind of quite strange sculptural objects. And I think that's actually kind of quite also interesting because, formally speaking, a lot, especially her sculptural practice, I think a lot of people have been saying that they are strange-looking, almost alien-like objects. And that's actually also because she's interested in exploring, in a formal way, prehistoric ideas or objects, but also having this kind of more almost understanding of what we think of futuristic design can become like as well. And then also, of course, it kind of going back to the root of the avant-garde. And so it's all this kind of very different way of looking at how an object can be formed. Maybe because these are actually being presented here in S.M.A.K, so you can...
So we thought also with Jung that it would be interesting to resume in the exhibition here to make those connections explicit. So as you see on the images here, so these are exhibition views of the show upstairs. So here Yang presents two versions, or perhaps doubles, of Janstrasse 5, which are works from 2017. Again, as a mirrored installation, as Jung mentioned, these are an extension of her blind appliance sculptures, a category of work in which Yang abstracts household devices, as Jung explained. So Janstrasse 5 alludes to the address of her former home in Berlin, modeled after the appliances in shape, size, and placements. placement, the works highlight the importance of the domestic environment. And for us, in making this exhibition, we thought that the central hall was a very dynamic space with a lot of visual stimuli, a lot of colors, a lot of elements, whereas we envisioned the two cabinets as spaces which are more quiet and which refer in a more subtle way to the domestic space. That was our wish. So mounted on the cabinet's right and cabinet's left walls, Janstrasse 5 is a grouping of box-like metal structures filled with tangled cables and also light bulbs, which are actually here veiled by the color gradations of the Venetian blinds opposite the works. So as you mentioned, these sculptures, they replicate the heat-generating devices, such as the boiler and radiators. In a way, for the artist, it's a way to make a kind of real-life connection, and also lending these sculptures a kind of aura of familiarity. Although the meaning of the objects really changes when stripped of their warmth-giving function. So the transition between the domestic space and actually the exhibition space is really practiced literally by the artist. So the bulbs that are visible through the permeable surfaces generate light rather than heat. So that's also another conceptual shift, which is important to mention. And also the linear compositions created by the partly drawn blinds resemble abstract painting. So again, this very important element of the relationship to abstraction and to painting. So through the lights, Yang infuses in Janstrasse 5 with a warmth that evokes the essential qualities of domestic heat. I would say that also this cultural series endeavors to reconcile personal and abstract experiences of the everyday life while reflecting on ideas of home, care, and belonging, which are issues and that concern each of us in society in every context. And also to think about the domestic sphere as the place where desire and aspiration are incubated. So I'll just finish on this by saying that Haegue Yang also meticulously abstracts these devices that provide actually for her a standard physical template for the sculptures. And I would say also that she tries to imbue them with a warmth and heat that is reminiscent of the functionality of these appliances in their original contexts.
Yeah, I think on that note, actually, it is actually quite important to also think about her practice in a way that is actually often she's creating very sensory experience as well. So the light is emitting certain kind of glow that is quite atmospheric in exhibition spaces, and that's part of that. I think later we'll talk a little bit more, but like often you do actually get a sense of like a smell or heat or wind blowing in your face. That's all been part of her sort of installation practice as well. But on that note, actually kind of going back a little bit more to, again, the idea of pairing or having the counterpart. So this is a text work that she's made that's been exhibited in different exhibitions already. And it's sort of, I chose this slide because, first of all, I think her text practice is actually not as known as the installations or the sculptures that she's made, but they are actually very important elements. And I don't think, I hope Haegue is not going to disagree with me, but I don't think she sees herself as a writer, but at the same time, the writing is actually a very important way of her to try to understand some of the subject matters that she's trying to explore in the practice. So here is the title, A Chronology of Conflated Dispersons, Duras and Young. So this work is actually comparing the biographies of two different 20th century cultural figures. So Marguerite Duras, of course everyone knows her, and with a Korean composer called In Sang-yong, who has also been a very important figure in Haegue's practice, who's got this extremely fascinating personal story. I'm just going to give a little bit of that because I think it might be easier to understand the context. And with Haegue, sort of be having the Korean context as well, which In Sang-yong actually moved to Germany at some point. He was really known as a very important figure in terms of modern composition in Korea. And for some reason, he was then kidnapped by the South Korean government, smuggled back into Seoul, imprisoned and tortured. And it actually became an international sort of incident, actually. I think a lot of the cultural figures in Germany at the time actually wrote an open letter petitioning for his release. So he was actually released after a number of years being imprisoned in South Korea, went back to Germany and vowed not to go back to South Korea again, and he actually died in Germany. And it has a lot to do with, I think, his stand at the time to what's been happening between the North and the South Korean governments. And I think partly because he perhaps has certain sympathies towards the North, the South Korean actually deemed him as a threat and maybe potentially on some sort of national security ground, imprison him because of that as well. So, that's the historical context of this really fascinating cultural figure, and that Haegue has been trying to actually understand more and more of his life, his work, and that's why actually a lot of what he's done, musically speaking, has been incorporated into Haegue's practice over the years. And here, his life story is being sort of positioned alongside the life of Jaurès, in a way who a French national but grew up in Vietnam, always had that really strong relationship with Vietnam, the country as well, the colonial history of that, who herself was a product of that as well. So it's kind of this kind of duality as a person living between different cultures and trying to actually create works, artistic works, that actually go against, to a certain extent, the larger, the macro sort of history is, I think, something that she's been really interested in as well. So I think that's why it's actually a very important piece that I think that I kind of wanted to sort of share with you today. And Haegue actually, over the years, she's actually been going back time again and again to certain 20th century cultural figures. So Jaurès is definitely one of them. This is a staging work that she's been doing for 15 years or so already. I've seen 2 versions of it, and she's still producing them. I think the next illustration of this performance will happen in New York actually later this year as part of the Performer Biennial. And I think she's also talking to other cultural venues in Europe to try to restage this work, which is based on a one-person play written by Jaurès, and she's often inviting current cultural figures, female cultural figures, to try to reinterpret this story. It's a monoplay, so it's always just one person standing on the stage performing this story. Here, I think I selected 2 different images from 2 different performances, which I actually got to see myself. One was actually performed as part of the Documenter in 2012. And the other one was staged in Hong Kong. So the reading was translated into Cantonese and performed by a very important a video artist from Hong Kong called Yo Jing. I think my recent conversation with Haegue about this work is that she's actually getting more and more involved with the casting process, trying to understand the boundary of gender through the casting and how because of that, the audience might actually understand the story in a different kind of context and different, opening up different possibilities as well. So it's actually quite exciting a challenge, I think, that she's having at the moment. But also, I think by repeatedly staging this performance, she's altering the context of the story depending on who's performing it, where it's being performed. And I think that's why she's actually always really interested in doing something with that. And also, for example, in Sanyong, we have been talking about producing a new blind installation based on the life story of In Sanyong. So I guess I can say, it's a conversation that I had with her about that. It's still very early stage in terms of the work, so we need to talk more. But she's saying that In Sanyong has just been staying with her. His life has been staying with her. She needs to get it out somehow. She needs to produce a work that could actually help her to understand her obsession with his life story. So this is sort of why we start talking about doing this work for Hayward. And so it's kind of quite interesting that all these kind of different figures have been so important in her practice. And I think the next slide might actually, this is actually an exhibition she did in London at the South London Gallery in 2019, if I remember correctly. Yes, that's correct. And here they've invited a Korean composer, Okuni, to perform her music, but in relation to In Sanyong's music, as well as Haegue's work. So she's actually inserted the music of In Sanyong in quite a few of her exhibitions, actually, throughout the years. But I think the Hayward new production might actually be the first time she's trying to actually producing a work of her own, directly addressing the life story in a sense, through a very abstract kind of way of this kind of really fascinating but important, but yet actually little known story of the Korean sort of cultural history. Yeah, maybe that's the point that we can relate again back to the exhibition here.
Yeah, so I will not expand a lot on this because what we wanted to propose you also is that after the lecture and the Q&A, we would actually go on site in the exhibition because in many of Haegue's works, the relationship of the body to the work itself, to the sculptures, is very important. And the perception and our activating our different senses. But in the show, so many of the sculptures by Haegue, I think specifically of the handles, are meant to be activated. And also important to mention in this for the audience members that don't know about her work that the bells and the way Haegue has used the bells in many of her work has made it one of her signature materials, I would say, in the recent time. But we will, so the work you see here on the foreground is part of Warrior Believer Lover version Sonic. So these are new productions. And this one is part of a group of 3 works called Sonic Stone Dance. And actually one of them that you see here with a handle is meant to be activated and trying to think about history, sounds, orality. The Haegue is interested in digging into diverse ritualistic uses of bells. So she has done this in the context of Korean shamanism, but not only that. It's not only restricted to that, it's also research and inquiry she has been doing also in relation to European pagan customs. And in the process of making the show here at S.M.A.K and discussing further with the team of the museum, there has been many discussions also about local customs here in Belgium that use bells in very specific contexts or uses that are so far from what Haegue is proposing. So again, to bring together things or cultures that are really far away from each other, but actually that have a common point. So this we will experience it afterwards in the exhibition space. Yeah, and I just want to say, to understand the work also, that that this is part of a category that Haegue calls the sonic sculptures. So they are, in terms of the way she frames her work, it is part of a very specific category. Yeah. But I, as Haegue says also, that for her, in relationship to this exhibition, it's very important that the audience just gets to experience the show first and foremost, without any preconceived ideas, without any information, and then to be able to further dig into the works. So this, after the talk, we will go upstairs and this will be activated, and you will also see, hear and feel how it is in context.
Yeah, so I thought this would be a nice sort of image and also work to talk about what we've actually all been talking so far. This work is called Handles, which was commissioned by MoMA in New York as part of the reopening of the collection in the atrium space. It was there for actually quite a long time, from 2009 until 2022. And so this commission brought together a lot of those different elements that we were talking about, the sonic sculptures you can see here, but they're also, because Haegue's got another series of works of the mobile sculptures, which are the ones that can be driven in a way, so it's like activated or performed. So these sonic sculptures function as such as well. They were performed by a team of performers on a scheduled basis. Can't remember whether it was daily or once a week, but they were performed. And also, In Sang-yong's music would be played at the same time as well, as part of the activation of the work or the space. And also these kind of, again, goes back to the strange looking sculptures, prehistoric almost, but because alien-like creatures. But they also, again, are references to different cultural figures, right? So in this instant, I think it was actually really influenced by the Swiss artist Sophie Tuba. I'm sorry about my pronunciation. I'm sure it's really bad, but it was actually really almost like homage in terms of her practice through this work, and she's also actually modeled or paid homage to many other different figures, from Felix Consolatorius to Solo Wit to actually Taiwanese artist Li Yuanjia as well for her show at the Tasting Arts. So I mean, that's sort of, she's always trying to rediscover or try to get to know these very important figures in cultural histories, and try to reactivate those stories through her interpretation and understanding. What actually an element that you can't quite see through this image at all is the sonic element of it. Whenever these sculptures are being activated or performed, because the materiality of them, they would make that ring, constant ring of these tiny little bells being moved around and being shaken. And that actually have very strong connection back to especially Asian shaman practices. How actually these kind of the rituals of performing with these bells are a way, almost a kind of medium to connect the earthly beings together with the spiritual realm. And that's also been part of the sort of thinking over the last few years in terms of connecting really Asian practices with contemporary life and contemporary issues. And that's also one sonic element that I find it very fascinating, and she's been actually inserting into, again, a lot of her exhibitions, which is actually a set of speakers. They're almost kind of loudspeaker looking, being hung from the ceiling. And they always just play one work, which I'm really sorry, the title escapes me at the moment, but I don't know if you remember that. But the work is actually a recording of a historic meeting between the South and the North Korean leaders in 2018. And of course, because it was kind of like a very sensational thing, like the entire world's media was there to try to capture that moment. And apparently at one point they went out somewhere without all these entourage to have a private conversation. And the media was trying to record that conversation from afar, but because they couldn't get close, so all they could actually get was actually the bird making noise and the leaves being blown through the wind and all that. So it's all the nature ambient noise that they were able to capture. That was it. They had no idea what that conversation was about at all. But Haegue found it so interesting, all these kind of ambient sounds actually represented that very, at least for, I think, for the region, and I think had a much greater international ramification as well, but for that region specifically, a very important moment in history. So she actually then wrote to the South Korean president office to get permission to showcase this work, or the recording. So it's been actually part of her exhibition language. I wouldn't even really call it a specific work per se. It's actually more part of her exhibition language, and a way to actually, through a very abstract kind of form, to try to address a very important political situation as well. Here, another multiple installation views of a show that she did at the Liam Museum in Seoul in 2015, if I remember correctly. Yes. Okay. Called Shooting the Elephant, Thinking the Elephant. That wasn't me, I think. But so here, I mean, the reason I sort of chose these images, it wasn't really to talk about the work in detail, but more to give you a sense of the practice as well, the scale of the practice, but also to highlight, again, going back to, she's very interested in sort of vernacular cultural tradition, crafts, and all those kind of things that have been very important to her. And they're like the polar opposite of all these kind of industrialized materials that she uses as well. So she's been learning about like Mexican basket weaving techniques, and she's been I think she's been she's gotten really good at it, actually. I think she can actually give her course now herself. But so here, all these installations, many of which are actually built with that kind of technique to become her sculptural objects or installations, really. And that one on the top right-hand corner, well, my right hand, your left, I guess, is called Dancing Lion, that work. And that is actually a reference to traditional Chinese dance that when people would actually dancing, it's called Dancing Lion if I translate it. So people would dress as lions and dance during New Year's as part of the celebration as well. So she's really kind of looking at like combining Mexican traditions with Chinese tradition and presenting the work in South Korea. So she's really trying to combine the different traditions in a way that is unexpected. And quite fascinating from my point of view, at least,
And to make a link between what you were saying previously about the use of text that is kind of distilled through all these biographies, but also through the work itself. Thought, we would zoom in again on the show here, only on a specific fragment. That the way Haegue has been working with works on paper as a way to kind of channel all the subjects we've been talking about. So what you see here is part of what she calls the Mesmerizing Mesh series that she started in 2021. That really attests to her interest in the relationship between spirit and matter. And the work you see here is entitled Flourishing Great Rejoicing Soul Glyph Mesmerizing Mesh number 169. So it's a new production for for S.M.A.K. And actually, Jung talked about text, but I think what is really interesting is that in these paper collages, Haegue channels a diverse range of indigenous or folk practices. As I mentioned previously, that really range from European paganism to also Asian shamanism. And the artist was actually originally inspired by ritualistic props made of hanji, which is a traditional Korean paper made from the inner bark of the mulberry tree. That is typically used actually in shamanistic rites that are aimed at purification, healing, and exorcism. So Haegue has started to extend this research into Korean shamanistic props to other parts of the world. As you were mentioning, she's really digging into so many countries and cultural contexts. So this work also shows our engagement with collage techniques, but also one could say an increasing emphasis on an anthropological approach, as well as image-making techniques such as symmetry, geometry, ornamentation, and symbolic patterns. And also it's important to talk about the process of making the work, because as the paper is folded prior to cutting, the props feature also highly symmetrical or kaleidoscopic compositions. I mean, you can see it explicitly on this image, for example, if you look at the upper part. So it's also related to the studio practice, which is, I think, is so important for Haegue. It's related. She's an artist who's constantly going back and forth between the research and the practice of working in the studio and making the work. So she's constantly oscillating between those two aspects. So here in the exhibition, you see the image in the center. She decided to place two newly produced mesmerizing mesh works above the entrance door to each cabinet gallery. And they mirror each other because you see them on each above each door, on the cabinet's left and cabinet right. And because actually the visitors of the exhibition walk below them to enter the side rooms, their location hints at a potential talismanic role. And it was indicated by Haegue that in certain Korean households, it is common to place a talisman above the door in order to provide protection and good luck and all these aspects. So she has brought this very specific, culturally specific element from the domestic space to, let's say, the exhibition space. She specifically chose a composition that leans here on the folk painting tradition of Moon Jawa, sorry for the pronunciation, in which the painting revolves around one or multiple Chinese characters that describe an ethical and communal value. And here Haegue chooses Heuni, which means being pleased, and the other one is Hui, on the other hand, which means double delight. And these are traditionally used for grand celebrations such as weddings. The Chinese character that means joy has been duplicated to create the two-part paper collage Flourishing Great Rejoicing Soul Mesmerizing Mesh 169. And in speaking, I would like to move away maybe from the description itself to speak about the context and our current time that we were discussing a lot with Haegue that about the current, situation in Europe, the war in the world, the precarious state of the economy and ecology, and for her to actually place these two works in the exhibition with the meaning they have was a way to have a message of encouragement, positiveness, within the exhibition, and to think about the current time. But I think there's a bit of irony in it, I have to say, knowing Haegue's Haegue's work and take. So as you see, the exhibition is quite dense and multi-layered, but it's not about knowing about everything. It's more about being able to zoom in, zoom out, and have a personal experience.
Yeah, so before I came to see the show, I think Haegue said like these two works, they are sort of her subtle and cheeky way of blessing the exhibition and the space as well. You know, I mean, because this type of design, let's say, of paper cuts, have those kind of inherent meanings, I think, in many Asian countries, and that's what she was trying to bring to the exhibition. But as I also, this is exhibition view of a show that she had in Berlin not long ago, actually, and I think one of the works is definitely in the S.M.A.K exhibition as well, the Sonic Cowpack, which is upstairs. The reason I kind of want to show this is just, I think, goes back to what Karima was saying, that it's kind of quite funny because if you notice, the title is 169. So like she's numbering every single one that they've made as well at the studio. And it's like, that's the scale that she's working on, because this series really sort of started maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's quite a recent new development in her practice, but she's actually being so driven and, you know, kind of wanting to understand the scale of production. What does that mean, having a studio, and what kind of scale production you can do as an artist today? So it's like kind of quite interesting that in that sense she's sort of exploring that, but then going back to something that's really ancient. And I think, you know, it's been sort of, I've been learning a lot through Haegue, through this series for sure. You know, we went to do research together in London. I had no idea, you know, these kind of traditions had really strong connections of paganism in the West. There were a lot overlaps, and I think there are actually a lot scholars out there that have been actually looking into this for many, many years already. Each region had their own take on you know, modern religion, you know, how actually humans sort of interacted with the spiritual realm, with something that's beyond them, and that's actually kind of quite an interesting thing for me to learn as well. Going back to, again, earlier, sorry, we're kind of jumping a little bit on purpose today. So to a very early important work that I love, again, it's a text-based work. It's called Bathroom Contemplation. It hasn't really been shown a lot, but it's actually been produced as a publication, as you can see here. And essentially, it's a script written by Haegue and her mother, based on a real-life interaction that they had in Berlin. So it was sometime after Haegue's moved to Berlin, her mother went to visit her, and there was an incident that happened in the bathroom, and there's a record of that incident, basically. If you look at the script, it's actually very, very, very kind of funny to a certain extent, but also very typical for someone like myself to sort of understand the parent generation's understanding of cultural behavior versus my generation, my upbringing and their upbringing, and how they actually sort of come head to head in a very, very mundane situation that is kind of explosive almost, but in a way, through that personal level, you can actually really understand the idea of diaspora, the migrant experience, and that's sort of been, again, I was saying earlier, been a very important aspect of her practice, and that's sort of something that we would like to highlight actually in the Hayward exhibition as well. Just to give you a sense of it, basically, I think it's her mother trying to take a bath in the in her apartment. But in Korea, they will always have a drainage on the floor in the bathroom, and she didn't realize that wasn't the case in Europe. So she flooded the toilet, basically, I think, during that moment. And then, of course, argument ensued. And, so this is a record of it. What I haven't actually really asked Haegue is that whether it's a straightforward sort of record of it or whether it's semi-fictional or whether it's entirely fictional. I think that's the really sort of interesting way that she's trying to obscure all those things that you're not entirely sure whether it's real or not, but it's so poignant at the same time. This is another earlier work. I think it's one of the earlier blind installations that she's done, and she's really known for these Venetian blinds installations. It's probably one of the more complex ones to a certain extent as well. By complex, not the scale or the structure, but actually the fact that she brought in a lot of different elements into this installation. So the work actually also functioned as a projection room. So Haegue, she's made a few videos, but she's, again, not really known as a video artist, but I think some of her videos, they tend to be video essays in a way, essay films that are very personal and talks about this diasporic experience in a very touching and poignant way. And so this work is often presented with another video work called Video Trilogy, which is, you can see a little bit of that, the projection there. And it's a work that she made across multiple cities, I think Berlin, London, Seoul, and she wrote the scripts, and it's often about this person experiencing alienation and loneliness in the urban setting, that she's kind of, this character is almost a nomad, floating through the different spaces and cities. And she would employ a voice actor to actually read the scripts instead of herself doing it. So it's actually, I think, if I remember correctly, it's one of the first times she did that as well. And it was sort of a very important turning point in her career, because it was at the time she actually, I think, started to exhibit more internationally. So she was actually moving between quite a lot of different cities for work reason, and then she started to feel this kind of sense of loneliness quite profoundly, and that's how and why she actually wanted to make this work, to try to address that feeling. But in this blind installation, like, you could actually get all the different elements that's just been really sort of important. So heat, like there's a heat lamp in the installation as well. So once you enter into space at a certain moment, if you walk past that part of the installation, that you can feel warm, sort of hitting you. And then there's actually a scent spraying thing, a device that would actually spray certain scent onto you as well. That's also part of, I think, her trying to create, not entirely perhaps domestic, but a very different kind of spatial experience for the audience in a more institutional or museum-like setting. And at the same time, I think it's a way to try to recall certain memories as well through these different devices actually being designed into this space. And this is another video work that's upstairs.
Yeah, that's another link also in relationship to the video essays by Haegue. So that one you see here is entitled Doubles and Halves. It was made in 2009. And I believe it was first shown in Haegue's solo presentation for the Korean Pavilion at the 2009 Venice Biennale. So for us, in terms of the exhibition, it was important to also show earlier work by Haegue that for her are not films, but rather video essays. The quality of the image itself is intentionally poor, let's say. When you look at this work, you really feel the material conditions also of the artist. Actually, this video essay was filmed in two distinct locations. The first one is Haegue, which is a neighborhood in Seoul, where Haegue was then living. And also Venice, more specifically the hidden spaces around the Korean pavilion in Giardini Park, the site of the annual International Art or Architecture Biennale. So what we see and witness in this video essay is that we see half of this neighborhood in Seoul that was in the process of living due to new developments, unfolding a kind of spooky state between total emptiness and the normal mode of inhabitation. The corners whereas the corners around the Korean pavilion in the Giardini showed off they're full of seasonal melancholy. So we really witness spaces that are a bit empty and a bit phantomatic. And this is something Jung talked about, the importance of the audio track and the voiceover that also bring a certain narrative in relationship to the places that Haegue is showing us. Maybe I will just read, because I think it's interesting to hear it with the voice, an excerpted citation from the chapter 2 of Doubles and Halves. So it's also organized, the work is built as in chapters, and that chapters in particular is entitled The Disappearance of Haegue Yang. And we hear the voice on the audio track that is uttering a soliloquy about nameless neighbors who never meet, and also two places that never overlap. Also thinking of imagining the non-existent community between the secret neighbors, the voice narrates a kind of unconditional interdependence, faith and generosity between these individuals through the metaphor of condensation, which is very important in relation to this work, and which was actually also the exhibition title at the artworks premiere in Venice Biennale. So I quote from the chapter 2. So they are gathering together again, forming themselves into droplets. People call this phenomenon condensation. It's just that ordinarily they do not condense because there is no temperature difference. Because the people in this neighborhood are useless and indifferent, they elicit enough temperature difference from each other. Even if the droplets flow down, the neighborhood is still full of water. In other words, they disappear at all times, but they leave the container full of water, which is what remains after the condensation. Even if they become halves and slide down, they leave behind the wealth intact. Unquote. So I would say, and Jung mentioned it explicitly, that actually these video essays, they are really much more personal, much more subjective than the sculptures you see in the show. They really...
Yeah, but I mean, I mean, we sort of talked about that already in the sense that the voiceover, the important factor is, first of all, that she's often working with voice actors, right? So it's not her. So that brings the layer of fiction to it, that you're not entirely sure like whose voice it is in a way in terms of script. But also, I think, as far as I know, they're all in English. So they're all spoken in English. But she's never actually worked with a native speaker either on purpose. So it's always someone with a different accent speaking in English. So it's all this kind of really slightly somewhat off, like something is slightly off about that voice and about the language and about the way they speak. That is actually very important in terms of creating this uncertainty about the imagery and the narratives that you are witnessing in front of you as well.
And I think also the first quote we shared about making neighbors elements or cultures or that are not necessarily neighbors to bring them together. I think through this work also Haegue tries to invoke the idea of commonness, but a commonness that doesn't require sharing anything in common. And I think this is what happens in this neighborhood in Seoul that we see actually. And this is related to the term of community of absence, and or negative community that was explored a lot by several philosophers. In relation to this, when I was doing some research for the show here, one can evoke the 18th century sources of the idea of negative community, as well as Georges Bataille's attempt to create a new community or secret society with acéphale. For his part, and writing after Maurice Blanchot's The Unavowable Community, and also Jean-Luc Nancy's The Inoperative Community, we could also cite Giorgio Agamben, who articulates the idea of a coming community, which he calls the whatever singularity. So very interesting also to step away from the exhibition and actually read these thoughts and these philosophers, because it gives some tools also to understand the work. And by doing so in the context of Doubles and Halves, Haegue also questions the specific temporality brought by the potentiality of the negative. So what does it imply to think in those terms?
Yeah, I think this is also a very important work of Haegue from 2004 called Storage Piece. The backstory is kind of interesting and funny because, again, it was that was the time that she started traveling for her work, for doing exhibitions internationally, but also doing residencies. So I think she was between places. She was actually going to do a residency in London, but she had to give up her apartment in Frankfurt. And she had nowhere to store her things. So she decided to make this work a storage piece, which basically all her belongings, all her works went into these boxes and crates. And they were being then stored in a gallery space, basically, because she couldn't move everything with her. And then, the work was collected, and, it's sort of been shown on different occasions. And what's actually very interesting is the fact that, there are multiple ways that you can present this work. And she's very open to it. It's always in conversation with the organization / the curator in terms of how this work should be presented. So here I selected a few images, so they're in different stages, different ways of being presented here. One is completely packed, and I think there are also exhibitions, especially I think the one in Latma, and also the one, the major survey that she had at Ludwig in Cologne, that was actually being performed as well, or activated, in the sense that the work would be unpacked throughout the duration of the exhibition. So, and it's actually really interesting because a lot of the early works of Haegue, they're in there. So if you want to see them, you kind of have to unpack them in order to see them, really. So, so we are planning to show this in London, and we are in conversation as to how we can actually present it. But sometimes actually it's also be presented as a stage, as a platform to stage performances. So she would actually invite other artists, or sometimes actually activists, to do a performance in relation to this work. And there's a script, again, it's written by Haegue, so it goes back to quite a lot of the other, especially the voiceover, I think that we're talking about, employing someone else to actually present her voice. And by the casting choices, then she sort of tries to make subtle, well, sometimes radical, depending on the choice, changes to the context of that script and that performance itself. We haven't decided how we're going to present this work yet. There are many questions as to how, and I think I think for an institution, unpacking something every day, it is actually quite challenging, I think, on the team. I think I haven't told our registrar that might be the case. But that would be actually kind of interesting. But then also, it's a work that, often is being discussed as almost a starting point of Haegue's sculptural practice as well. Of course, she's done other works before this, but in terms of scale, in terms of nature, in terms of the way that she understands formally how to address creating a sculptural language, I think this is actually a very important starting point, and hence why we are very interested in presenting it in London.
Thank you, Jung. So I think time-wise, we are going to conclude, but we wish to open up for questions if there are any from the audience about what was being discussed and presented today. I think we have a microphone over there if anyone has a question.
Thank you for the very informative talk. I wonder if you, Yang, could describe if there's a difference in the perception of her work in South Korea and in Europe. I think Haegue lived now maybe almost longer in Germany than she has been living in
you're absolutely right. And that's actually a very interesting question. Last year I did an interview, like an online interview with Haegue for a Korean publication. And I think we sort of talked a little bit about that in a way that she asked me whether I would consider her to be a Korean artist. I said, no, I think you're just Haegue Yang to me, and also you are international practicing artist, internationally practicing artist. So I never actually really sort of, I never really understand her in that context. Of course, some of the works like her interest in Insan-Yong, for example, and the sound piece about the meeting between the North and the South Korean government leaders. I think those are very specific to the Korean context. And I think some of the earlier works as well actually would address more directly in terms of the socio-political sort of histories, but also the context of Korea. But what I find interesting, she actually, because she started, her practice really sort of started in Europe. She was actually more known in Europe when she first sort of being exhibited, and then she became known in Korea. So I think they have this very interesting relationship with her as well in terms of looking through her work, but also she's been elevated to a point that she's a household name in South Korea, really. She's beyond just a contemporary artist. No, she's on magazine covers. I think if you talk to the South Korean art world, they would see her as one of the pride and joy, that's able to conquer the West, so to speak. So it's actually, I think she has this very interesting relationship with being regarded as a South Korean artist. We actually made the decision of removing that in our internal document. So like when we put together internal texts in relation to exhibitions that we are working on, the bio of the artist is always part of that, and often you would say, oh, this is a Belgian artist, a French artist, blah, blah, blah. So the first draft would be South Korean artist, or Korean artist Haegue Yang. But after speaking with her, that was removed on purpose, because I think she's really trying to, or I think she's hoping that, going forward, her practice can be understood on a much elevated level, let's say, that is actually beyond the bound of being identified through a single nationality.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, because I think like I see there's an origin in her work that's also has to do with South Korean history, maybe, and so I don't see it as elevated or as kind of to put a value on it, but just as kind of purely in content-wise, if there are different elements picked up in her work, then there than here, so to say, like that. Just the points of interest maybe are different. Like you also in the beginning, you were talking about elements of abstract forms, and like the biography of being in two places. So these are still also like the biography of the two places is yeah, it speaks also to her choice of moving.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, what I'm not trying to say that, we need to deny anything Korean. Or, no, that's not the case at all. And I think, some of the practices, some aspects at least of it, is actually very much rooted in certain kind of Korean tradition as well. The Hanji paper that she's using, the shaman sort of practices is actually, I think the first point of reference for her would be Korean. Then from there she went to other regions, but ultimately, I think it's also the framework that. What's interesting for me is the idea of being transnational, right? And I think that's something that has sort of been really talked about in art history and in terms of understanding artistic practices, the idea of transnationality or transnational. I think Haegue sort of sits perfectly within that context. But also what's quite interesting is that, we're talking about the show in London, and I think we are trying to highlight that aspect, being transnational as a practice or as an artist, and it's important in the sense that, because I think since 5, 6, whatever years ago, I think there's backlash against globalization in all aspects of our society. I think a lot of what's happening now is a reaction against the sort of heightened globalization in the 80s and 90s, and movement of people, movement of goods, movement of culture. So it is actually quite important, I think. We never really sort of talked about that, but I'm just thinking about it now. It might actually be quite important for Haegue to highlight this idea of transnational, because it's actually almost a political way of countering the backlash against that. So perhaps that's why I think we're talking about something that's beyond her identity of being South Korean, and that's sort of the part of the reason, maybe. Yeah.
I just have a remark to. I actually find it very interesting that all those aspects still keeps. Yeah, I find it interesting that those aspects of her own original identity keep coming, and they will, because also in the recent show here, what you explained about I actually came here 2, 3 times, but today I saw this kind of talismanic, you said, the mirror image on both doors, above the doors. And I think each one of us also have a kind of relation, or we go back into our own history or a relation to our own culture and try to see things. I found it, that's what I feel, that I find it actually very interesting that those things keeps coming, and they will. And I don't think it needs to be hidden or taken away. Maybe they will fade and they will have this, as you say, this the mixed of different elements, and yeah, it will always show up over the time, because I don't know how long she is now living in Germany, but you see also in the recent show those elements. So I find it very interesting that they stay in the work. Thank you. It's very interesting.
Thank you for the comment.
I think there's someone.
Thank you. Well, I was thinking that actually the the identity of the artist, you can really see it like in the materials, in the colors, in the textures, in the way that she shows it. I just feel like all these transnational concept, it stands for the message, like the message that she wants to give. It's like for everybody. It doesn't have like political boundaries. I feel like she's trying to keep like her identity as something more like a mixture, and not as a Korean or German or just because like her history is all mixed up in different cultures, and maybe in that way she could get to more people like being identified with her work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think ultimately, because I think, I mean, the question of highlighting one's nationality or identity is often, I think, it's just a societal framework that we can use to understand a person. Right, so as an artist, you can't get away from that. I think that's so often, but ultimately, the practice is not really about that. As you can see, I mean, like, or you just, you were saying that, you can sort of tell, these kind of different roots, and she goes back to them, and I don't think she's hiding that at all, right? But it's more just, it's exactly, but like she's presenting them through her lens, through her interpretation, and through her experiences, and I think that's sort of. I mean, that's why I think I sort of mentioned the fact that, for the show at Hayward, I would like to really highlight the sort of personal aspect of her practice, which is something that, of course, is talked about. I'm not saying nobody's talking about that, but for me, that's so important. But I think it's a really selfish thing, because when I met her, she was doing, storage piece, and, it's like that moment, she was really like bathroom contemplation. Those works really stayed with me, when I first met her, and that's how I understood her practice at that time. So I think for me, is sort of working with an artist like that is actually the both of us sort of putting in our own versions of our history into the show and try to combine the two together and present a version of Haegue to the audience, that might not be similar to the S.M.A.K exhibition, but it's a version of that history and our relationship in that sense as well.
No, I was going to ask if there was another question, or yeah.
Can you give us a little bit a brief explanation about the bells, something which is related with the, I don't know, paganist ideas?
The bells.
The bells. I mean, some artists use as well, I think Magnus also, he almost used like a symbol, I think. I don't know if it is related with the modern spellers, but again, yeah, generally, as I see that there is a kind of trend now, artists are getting back into this tradition, and it could be, yeah, Vincent Dito's work, she also has been referring, yeah, to the African. It could be medicine man or a voodoo priestess. And also it's probably the same thing, I think, the artists here are using such a medicine. And I wanted to know, the essence of paganism, for example. I don't know. It could be for not only for the artist, generally. I understand less about this areas.
I'm glad you actually make the connection between the exhibition of Grace Ndirutu, Healing the Museum, and Haegue Yang, because although there are not explicit links, there are some connections, but I mean, in relationship to shamanism, from the point of Haegue, it comes from somewhere else. For the practice of Grace Ndirutu, it has different roots and it's expanding in another direction. But for us, in a way, it was important to have on this floor of the museum a panorama of a certain generation of female artists that come from various contexts, but that can approach these themes in a very different way. So I'm glad you noticed that. I'm very happy. But to come back to Haegue, I think it's interesting also to hear your comment about the way you perceive the way contemporary artists work today, which materials they are drawn to, what you call as trends. Well, but to come back to Haegue, I think the recurrence of the bells in the work is something she has been busy with for, I think, 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And as Jung explained earlier, when Haegue engages in a series or in a body of work, it's very intensively. It's very intensively for the production, but also for the series, the variations. So I think it has, of course, these roots related to Korean shamanism, but it's always, the roots are always expanded and they really become kind of diasporic, I would say. So it's not only a sign of a certain Korean cultural specificity, it becomes taken into something broader, it's abstracted, and then it's a sculpture. And you can see that, but you can also see an abstract sculpture. This kind of two-folded way is important also because it gives a certain autonomy and freedom to the work. I don't know if I answer your question, but yeah, I'm trying to understand it in there. Thanks.
If I may, I would like to ask a last short question, but thank you very much for the introduction and the very rich and intriguing oeuvre of Haegue Yang. But personally, I'm very curious about the titles of the works by Haegue, because you have been indicating that language and texts are very important for her. There's the neighboring, there's the doubling, there's the combination of Western and Eastern influences. But for me, it's very hard then to pinpoint where the titles come from. So I would like to know a bit more about that.
Well, I'm sorry. I think they've shifted, at least from my point of view, they've shifted. The earlier works, they're much more direct, like storage piece. Literally, it's a storage. Right? Bathroom contemplation. So it gives you actually a really clear sense of the content, at least, or sometimes the form as well of the work. But I think at some point it really shifted. And it becomes a combination. So, the sonic sculpture series, you will still start with sonic sculpture and then something else alongside it. So often I think they are actually, of course, some of which are actually in reference to other practices or other works that actually have influence on the work that Haegue is making. But sometimes they're actually kind of cheeky, sort of ironic sort of interpretation of what she's doing as well. She does have this sense of humor if you look at the work itself, you might not get it immediately because they are quite formal, in line with this traditional conceptual art. But as a person, there is a very strong sense of humor and can be quite cheeky. So I think sometimes it comes through the titles, actually. That's where, you know, and that's an aspect I think is slightly more hidden, but it's actually kind of quite interesting. And you sort of, you get a sense of the writing as well. She's very involved with every writing, every piece of text that an exhibition produces. And it's sometimes, it kind of really depends on the situation. I think it shifts from one to the other. It goes back and forth a little bit as well.
Yeah, and I could give maybe one example. We haven't talked about it on purpose because there will be a second event on the 20th of August with Yilmaz Zeweyer, the director of Musée Ludwig in Cologne, and Christine Mering, professor at the University of Chicago and curator at the Smart Museum. But the photos we showed you with the blue paint on the wall is actually a wall paint that Haegue has titled Quasi Yves Klein Blue. So the title in that sense is very explicitly referring at her own conceptual strategy and the concept of the piece, and I think the irony also towards artistry. But I would just maybe 1 or 2 minutes explain actually it's a wall paint, and when Haegue was working at S.M.A.K, she was, so everyone, I mean most of us know that the bleu Yves Klein is one of the few colors in artistry that was patented by an artist, by French artist Yves Klein. And in the process of preparing the exhibition at S.M.A.K, Haegue made a survey within the team of the museum by proposing them several shades of blue that resemble the bleu Yves Klein, and asking some of the staff members, according to them, which blue is the closest to the bleu Yves Klein. And the shade that had the most votes is the one you see upstairs in the exhibition. So this is the process behind the scenes, but I think beyond that, the title, I think in that case, is full of irony, because she also wanted, by this process of having the vote within the museum team, she also wanted to refer to to highlight the precarity of the decision-making process in a museum, who has the authority to decide this or that is important or this or that is valuable, or the hierarchies we can find in a museum. But beyond that, also the title is a way for her to insert her own position in this kind of Western male-oriented artistry, but to insert herself in a very precise and radical way. So I think, yeah, the title is also like a thread. If you pull it, there are so many lines already. So this, I think, this is maybe one of the examples that shows how the title is loaded and also referring to very specific conceptual strategies. Yeah. Not sure if there are further questions. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Jung, for being with us today. I just wanted to mention that there will be 2 other events related to this exhibition. So the second one will take place on 20th of August. It will be also a paired talk between 2 curators and scholars. So we will invite Christine Mering, who is a professor of art history at the University of Chicago, and she's also adjunct curator at the David and Alfred Smart Museum of Art in Chicago, and she will be in conversation with Yilmaz Zeweyer, who is the director of Musée Ludwig in Cologne. And then on the 3rd of September, there will be an artist talk by Haegue here at S.M.A.K. So thanks a lot again. Thank you, Jung. And for the ones of you that still have time and wish to join us, we propose you to follow us upstairs in the exhibition, and to maybe continue the conversation in an informal way, but also to view an activation of Haegue's sculpture, Sonic Stun Dance, Angular Circular. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.